Good morning. Thank you all for being here this morning. We're going to have a very interesting panel that is going to talk about a lot of different issues that you probably didn't think about when you heard the word philanthropy. Because one of the cool things about covering the world of philanthropy, as I have as editor of the Chronicle of Philanthropy, is that this area touches on pretty much everything any of you are covering. And our panelists here probably, if they don't know the answer to something or don't know somebody who does, they probably are just a few degrees of separation from the people who do. So they are wonderful sources as well as wonderful stories. My name is Stacy Palmer. I do edit the Chronicle of Philanthropy. I'm happy to help you with anything you're doing as you're navigating this area. And it is a quiet area. And one of the things you probably noticed when we did this panel is that these aren't the household names that you're used to when you think of philanthropy. We don't have Bill Gates here. We don't have Pierre Omidyar. We don't have Eli Broad. And there's a reason for that. The people who are here are actually doing some of the most interesting work, but they don't call attention to themselves. And so we have a chance now to find them out, but most of what they're doing is fascinating behind the scenes work that has very big implications for you all. Tomorrow we'll hear from Giving USA, which will give us the numbers about just how philanthropy has been going. And that's embargoed information for tomorrow, so that's a story peg for those of you who want to write something. Without even looking at the numbers, I can tell you that the fastest growing form of philanthropy is sitting at this table. One of the things that we've seen as the stock market has been going gangbusters is that philanthropy is growing very strong with many affluent people, and a lot of folks are channeling it into the kinds of philanthropy that's represented here. So I think this is really what a lot of people, a lot of readers are actually doing. So the trends you'll hear about here are very important. One of the most interesting developments in philanthropy we've seen lately is from a household name. Mark Zuckerberg gave $1.5 billion to the Silicon Valley Community Foundation. He gave that money in the form of a donor-advised fund, and we will hear now and you will learn about what donor-advised funds are. He didn't set up his own foundation. It's not the Zuckerberg Foundation. That's a really important development. What a lot of people are seeing is the third wave of philanthropy. So those are some of the kinds of things we'll talk about today. We'll also talk about policy and about sources. One of our speakers is doing some really interesting work in the criminal justice area, but also in the journalism world. And really behind some of the studies that we all refer to when we're trying to make this transition to a digital world. So I can already tell you that there's lots for you in lots of different ways. We're going to have them talk a little bit about what they're seeing in the world of philanthropy. Then we'll take your questions and talk a little bit about what they're seeing. To kick this off, I'm going to start with Henry Berman, who leads Exponent Philanthropy. He will explain to you what that means, because it's an unusual term and a new one for this association. Henry?
Thanks, Stacy. Good morning, all of you. Thanks for coming to learn what I'd like to call, or in your title, the diverse power of 21st century philanthropy. It's a subject I'm both familiar with and, frankly, excited about. And both of those stem in part from my current role as the CEO of Exponent Philanthropy, a position I've held since 2011. But I'm also a member. I'm actually a dues-paying member and have been since 2003, given that I've served as a foundation president and a co-trustee, and I continue to do that. So it's been over a decade now. And in addition to that, my wife and I contribute to and recommend grants from a donor-advised fund as part of our philanthropic efforts. And while I'm no Bill Gates, no, he really isn't here, I also utilize my checkbook and make individual contributions to nonprofits in which we believe, as well as being actively involved with some of them beyond just donations. So in my position at Exponent Philanthropy, that allows me to see through literally thousands of eyes beyond my own what's happening in the world of philanthropy. And that's because Exponent Philanthropy comprises thousands of philanthropic leaders who work in virtually every community across the country and many of them around the world, supporting causes of every kind. Our members use a wide range of giving vehicles and strategies to accomplish their philanthropic goals. Their assets range from small to large. Some are new to giving, others have been around for quite a long time. Yet one thing they have in common is that they all choose to put their funding into the community rather than their own infrastructure. So almost by definition, and usually by intent, that results in a lean, agile, passionate, and highly responsive form of philanthropy. But please don't confuse infrastructure with impact. For perspective, We know from our latest survey reflecting 2012 that Exponent Philanthropy members steward more than $71 billion with a B dollars in assets, award more than $4 billion annually, and on average spend just 15 cents per dollar on operating costs. So with that as context, let me share with you two trends that I see taking place. The first is that our members, as well as those who share the characteristics of operating in this lean manner, are increasingly using multiple giving vehicles. And the second is that this diverse community of donors is operating collectively and individually as true agents of change. So first, the use of multiple giving vehicles. Well, I want you to think for a moment that you're redoing your kitchen. And you've hired a skilled carpenter to come in and do a lot of the work. Well, she has a rip saw for cutting 2x4s and a jigsaw for doing fine cutting work. And there's certainly probably a miter saw for getting those 45-degree angles just right. And probably also a hacksaw for the piece of pipe that the plumber left behind. So several different saws, each one capable of making cuts, and in her skilled hands being used appropriately, you might even say strategically, to get a job done. Likewise, there's multiple tools available to today's philanthropists, and more often, they're using many of them, not just one. Sometimes it's about leveraging the profile of a foundation name. Other times, donors may want the ease and convenience and immediacy of simply writing a check out of their personal account, while another occasion might call for the anonymity that a donor-advised fund might offer. So, as with our carpenter who uses many saws, today's donors have many tools. And like our carpenter, they're using them with thought and with intent. The upshot of all this is that people are thinking more strategically about where their money goes, how it gets there, and what it accomplishes. And that's really the good news in all of that. The second trend I mentioned is the growth of donors as agents of change. For a long time, the world of philanthropy has been a vertical one. Funders at the top, recipients below, often making it difficult for ongoing interaction. But today's donors operate on a much more horizontal plane. Funders, especially those with lean operations, as I described earlier, are more often than not on the same level as the nonprofits, and thus able to interact in new ways, to build trust, to work hand in hand. So these funders recognize the expanding economy of philanthropy, an economy where knowledge, intention, and passion are the new currencies, an economy where technical assistance, capacity building, convening, communications, connections, and advocacy are tools as powerful as checkbooks. And they understand how much can be accomplished by using these tools to leverage the impact of their dollars. These people are indeed agents of change. Now, scientists will tell you that any healthy ecosystem, in that ecosystem, survival depends on sharing nutrients, energy, and other resources. So as philanthropists, our contributions to the systems are critical. Yet without a healthy coexistence with those we fund, our grants and our dreams are likely to fall short of our desired impact. The agile and responsive donor of today is well positioned to collaborate with all the stakeholders within the community, helping to see that their money and so much more gets where it needs to go to do the most good, whether that's for inner city kids who need a new ball field, for a local symphony that may be struggling, or perhaps finding permanent housing and work for the homeless. The newly emerging brand of donor is actively involved, and as a result, they really are effective agents of change. You're going to hear from some terrific colleagues, and after that, be happy to try and answer any questions. So thank you.
Next, we're going to hear from Emily Tao Jackson, who runs her family foundation, the Tao Foundation. This is an example of what Henry's been talking about. Emily?
Thank you. Good morning. Wonderful to be here. As Stacy said, I run my family foundation, the Tao Foundation. It was established 25 years ago by my parents, Leonard and Claire Tao. They have an amazing sort of American dream story coming from extreme poverty, growing up, no access to at any real opportunities, and yet they found a way to go to Brooklyn College when it was free, to build a business from the experience that they had, the connections, and find themselves in a place where they were suddenly very comfortable and immediately turned to how can we help others. I think this is a fairly typical story of family foundations. People who are self-made or have come into an inheritance who have decided that they couldn't possibly pass down all this money to their own children, and they see real serious problems in the world and they'd like to address them. Our foundation started out with the things that we knew. We funded medicine, higher education, and cultural institutions. Very typical story of family foundation, because these were the areas that my parents felt that they had helped them to achieve success. They had access to quality medical care, they had access to good education, and they were exposed to cultural institutions and the arts. And so they wanted to offer that to others who couldn't necessarily afford that. But it didn't feel deep enough for us. It didn't feel like we were really impacting the kind of societal issues that we were reading about in the newspapers, but struggling to say, how could we really make a difference? We see a lot of stories about things that create fear and frustration, but we don't often see stories about solutions and how we can see ourselves as part of the solution. So our foundation decided to tackle some issues where we felt there was enormous potential to make change happen, but we didn't really know how to do it. And we thought we would use the vehicle of our family foundation to experiment. We have this wonderful privilege to have put money into a fund that that really gives us permission to experiment, take risks where others aren't willing to. And so we've found that we have engaged in a lot of what I would call non-traditional philanthropic activities that we found to be extremely effective. The first thing was to become a really good listener and not necessarily go in saying we know how to fix these problems, but really meeting with communities who were struggling and ask them the questions, what would really be of help to you? Then we tried to bring people together who might not generally talk to each other and could potentially really influence change. So community leaders and government leaders. In the case of, we have been funding criminal justice reform, specifically juvenile justice reform, as a niche area that we found when we said, how can we really make the biggest difference? And so just bringing prosecutors and public defenders together for the first time, not as adversarials, but to say, what can we really do together for kids? So facilitating those conversations, leveraging wherever we could, because we were a small foundation, we're never going to be able to solve huge social problems. So finding partners wherever they may be. And some of them have money, some of them have power, some of them have other types of social capital. We need all of those partners. And I think small foundations and large are looking to those partners to really catalyze the work that they want to do and really help realize substantial change. In that exercise, it led us to really exploring not just helping small groups, nonprofits that were helping finite groups of individuals, but we needed to think beyond 50, 100, even 1,000 people who were being helped. And that led us to work on policy change, because we felt like if we could change policy that could potentially impact tens of thousands of individuals, that would be a really useful strategy for us. So we made a choice to use our investments not to fund projects that had necessarily personal meaning to us. I think a misconception that a lot of foundations are really just funding their own pet projects. But we went into areas where we felt there was the greatest need. And we started asking questions. Where would our investments really mean the most? Where would they have the most value? And so we have decided to dedicate and focus our efforts into funding areas that both philanthropy doesn't usually go and issues that aren't generally covered by the media. And so I think we have learned to how to get to this unique inside kind of nonpartisan perspective and develop really a great story about how change can happen. So I mentioned criminal justice, juvenile justice. Our foundation decided that this was an area where there was almost no private money going. There were really deep social problems, that kids were being thrown away every day as if their lives didn't matter, yet they were going to be costing society for the rest of their lives. There's a tremendous amount of data out there right now, and a lot of reporting about the bad stories, about what's going wrong in neighborhoods, the stats of how our country is leading the world in locking people up. But what do we do about it? And so I have access as a philanthropic leader and as a funder and partner to system leaders in government, to frontline workers who are working in facilities and really understand what's going on there. Youth and families who are impacted by the system, young people who want to speak out for themselves and their friends and neighbors, members of the law enforcement community who are thinking about the fact that their strategies aren't necessarily working and what can they do different, and community leaders as well. So, I mean, our goal is really to help move away from a culture of fear and move more towards stories about solutions and help the public see that they can be a part of those solutions. So Stacy mentioned that we also at the Tao Foundation have some very deep investments in digital journalism. We saw the state of newspapers really changing. Every moment journalism is shifting and changing, and it's really quite a challenging issue for a lot of newspapers and reporters, and newspapers are disappearing, and online journalism and a different style of reporting is dominating the field. And we felt that this was an area that we couldn't ignore, and that we couldn't just watch a change in a way that didn't have participation from those of us who had the ability to make serious investments in an infrastructure and training of a new generation of journalists. And we have two robust projects that we're supporting at graduate schools of journalism at Columbia University and the City University of New York, both in entrepreneurial journalism and digital journalism, with a real focus on big data, privacy, First Amendment issues, and the marrying of computer science and journalism. So actually at Columbia, we have the first dual degree program with the School of Engineering and the School of Journalism. And those are pretty exciting. And we've also delved into some journalistic projects that are specific to the criminal justice reform work that we're doing, funding fellowships for journalists who would like to write stories about juvenile justice reform. We have a fellowship at the John Jay College of Criminal Justice, where reporters come and learn in depth about issues that are facing this population, changes that are on the horizon, policy opportunities, access to sources, and then they become part of a network. So that's just one example of an exciting journalistic project that we're focusing on. So small foundations, big impact. That's what I talk about all the time. We have 5 staff people. We give away about $12 million a year. So we have to be very creative with how we give our money away, and we need all the partners that we can get to work together with. And I'm very excited to be here today and to, offer up that organizations like mine can be excellent sources themselves and also access to sources, and really understanding the stories behind some of these very upsetting and tragic news stories that we all go home and say, what could I possibly do about this problem? So foundations can be a fantastic resource in that area. So I hope I'll be able to answer some questions later. Thank you.
Thank you. And I really want to underscore that point. Foundations really do offer excellent sources, often to people that you can't get access to. When Emily said she listens, that listening pays off because people trust her and she can help open doors to the kinds of people who you might not easily be able to get on the telephone or know who to call. So they're very helpful that way. I would also say that one of the points she made about people looking for solutions is an incredibly important one. We don't talk about that often enough. And that's one of the things foundations are doing. And I would say it's not just the digital transition that is causing such challenges for newspapers, but the fact that we don't write enough about solutions, and foundations have a way to do that. We're going to shift the conversation a little bit to where the money is, because our next speaker is really at the source of, we always hear these stories about the transfer of wealth and how much money is changing hands. And one of the ways it will change hands is to go into donor-advised funds, which is something that Andrew Hastings, as a top official at the National Philanthropic Trust, has his eye on. Because there's a lot of money, there's also some policy debate that I think he'll talk about as well. Should tax reform ever get on the agenda? Should anything happen in Congress ever again? We will hear some conversation about some of the issues. And donor-advised funds are something that Representative Camp has in his tax bill, and I think we'll talk specifically about that. It's a policy area that's important to understand. So with that, Andrew.
Thank you, Stacy. Thank you, everybody. Before I dive into my remarks, a couple of observations. I completely want to echo what both Henry and Emily have said. We see the same trend lines, and I think, frankly, this is a story. Philanthropy writ large is probably one of the largest uncovered stories in America right now. If you think back 100 years ago, it was the 1913 Tax Act that established foundations in this country. And at that time, it launched the Rockefellers, the Carnegies, the Fords, and a golden age of philanthropy in this country. We now fast forward 100 years later, and the names have changed to Gates, Zuckerberg, Omidyar, and others that Stacy has mentioned, and we're in a new golden age of philanthropy. Americans are going to give $1 trillion to charity in the next 3 years. $1 trillion, not one with a B, that's a T. And you're going to have the largest intergenerational transfer of wealth the world has ever seen, and money is going to be going into philanthropic and charitable causes never seen before in this country or the world. Yet, philanthropy can't do it on its own. As Henry mentioned, we see the largest foundations in this country gathering together. It's the Gates, it's all these foundations co-investing to make transformational grants to move the needle on major social issues and problems in this country. It's an exciting time. And as the Chief Development Officer at the National Philanthropic Trust, it's a privilege to be kind of on the front doorstep for many people when they are in the formative stages of their philanthropy, or as Henry mentioned, in their most mature stages, and they're looking at an alternative or another vehicle in which to express or pursue their philanthropic initiatives. So what we do is at the National Philanthropic Trust is primarily sponsor donor-advised funds. We have 3,000 donors, over $2 billion in charitable assets. And last year we gave almost $300 million to charities throughout the United States and in countries around the world. Donor-advised funds, for those of you who don't know, is the fastest growing and most popular charitable giving vehicle today. In fact, there are more donor-advised funds established than foundations and every other charitable giving vehicle combined. And the reason is that they've really offered for many donors a simple, flexible, and very efficient and cost-effective vehicle to support their charitable causes. And just so we're all on the same page, I'll just briefly describe what a donor-advised fund is. Essentially, a donor is making an irrevocable, unconditional gift to a public charity, which in our case would be National Philanthropic Trust. The asset is liquidated, the monies are invested, they're allowed to grow tax-free, and then the donor can recommend grants to their favorite charitable causes at any time. Simple, right? But as Stacy said, with the heightened growth of donor-advised funds, which is now accounts for, right now there's over 200,000 donor-advised funds established, over $45 billion in assets, grants made totaling $9 billion last year, or in 2012, we've come under increased scrutiny. There's an interest in how it is that they're operated. So I'm going to cover some of the myths that have emerged over the last few years and try to address some of those, as well as highlight some of the policy changes that are also coming to the fore. So first, one of the myths that has arisen over donor-advised funds is that with the donor-advised fund, as I said, when the donor makes the gift, they get an immediate tax deduction for their gift. and that there's a concern that somehow that the assets are held in perpetuity. The fact is that donor-advised fund assets have only one place to go, and that's to charity. There's absolutely no incentive for a donor to household this money in perpetuity. I mean, if you want to shelter money, put it in the Cayman Islands. Don't put it in a donor-advised fund. You know, you can't buy a TV, you can't buy a car with these monies. You have to make a grant to charity. The other thing is that there's a study done by the Indiana University that surveys high net worth donors and what their prime motivation is to making gifts to charity. The number one reason, number one, by far and away, is to make a difference. Tax deductions rank 11th. The motivation for donors is truly to be philanthropic. Obviously, there's some that may weigh the average of tax deduction over making a difference a bit more, but ultimately, at the end of the day, the money is trying to go towards making the world a better place. The other thing is that, as far as I know, nobody's been able to outlive any of their money or their assets. Even Ben Franklin, who established an endowment that lasted for 200 years, couldn't outlive his money. So it would be the same with donor-advised funds. So the notion that somehow they can be householded in perpetuity doesn't hold water. Another concern is that somehow the monies that are going to donor-advised funds are being somehow almost like taken away from charity, that donor-advised funds are not increasing charitable giving. The fact is the exact opposite. Donor-advised funds have not only increased giving in this country, but they've also increased the giving power of donors as well. Since 2009, charitable giving in this country, after the credit crisis and the Great Recession, has increased by 4%. The amount of grants made by donor-advised funds during that same period has increased 32%. In addition, donors can make gifts to their donor-advised funds of appreciated securities. Now, if you were to call a charity today, say a local soup kitchen or a church, and say, I have 1,000 shares of MSFT, I need to DTC it to you ASAP, can you help me out? That charity, the eyes would roll in the back of their head and say, what are you doing? Talk English to me. The English translation is, I want to make a donation to you of 1,000 shares of Microsoft. I want to transfer it electronically to you. Most charities don't have brokerage accounts, let alone the ability to accept a private estate, S corporation stock, C corporations, limited partnerships, multilateral collateral debt obligations, or anything else of that nature. We at the National Philanthropic Trust in the last month closed $65 million in gifts of private real estate, limited partnership interests, and privately held stock. $65 million. This is unlocking assets that heretofore would not go to a charitable organization. In a sense, you've probably heard of the term fracking, which kind of has some negative connotations in the oil industry, but I look at it as like philanthropic fracking. We're unlocking these assets that heretofore are not able to be easily liquidated, real estate and other privately held interests, and putting them toward charitable causes. And at the $65 million that we just closed, $10 million is immediately going to be granted out to a charity in the near future, in the next 6 months. In fact, one of the donors in that case, bless you, was so impressed by the work that we did on their gift that we're now working on behalf of one of the trustees at the University of Chicago to help them effectuate an 8-figure gift to the University of Chicago. The other thing is that on the giving power side is that since donor-advised fund assets can grow tax-free, it actually allows the donors to increase their giving power over their lifetime through the magic of compound interest. So today's $25,000 or $50,000 contribution to their donor-advised fund could ultimately realize hundreds of thousands of dollars towards charitable use over the lifetime of that donor-advised fund. In addition, we are also seeing an increasing trend of donors to making an impact abroad. NPT has helped donors make grants to charities in 55 countries worldwide, and that number is growing every single year. In fact, over the last 4 years, our international grant making has doubled every year. If you're to make a grant to a foreign charity as an individual donor, you're going to spend thousands of dollars in legal bills to be able to comply with the IRS and Department of Treasury and U.S. State Department guidelines to make a foreign grant, whereas we're able to help assist those donors to be able to do those grants directly to those causes where it really needs it most. And these include countries such as Africa, the Middle East, and South America. Stacy mentioned the Camp proposal. This is a current budget proposal that Congressman Camp from Michigan has proposed, and one of the major provisions of that is for a payout requirement. The donor-advised funds should increase the level of payouts and do it within 5 years after a donor-advised fund establishes it. Now, we don't know where this is coming from or why, because the fact is that donor-advised funds without a payout requirement grant out 37% of their dollars annually. That's a new statistic that we've just analyzed from our report that we publish every single year, and that's 4 times, of the average payout rate of foundations, which is about 9%. Our concern is by forcing a payout requirement of donors, you're forcing them to inadvertently send out money that's not very well thought out, or as Henry mentioned, very strategically used. Donors are very thoughtful in their philanthropy more often than not. They want to support their charitable causes, but they want to do it and make sure that there's an impact. Forcing people to make decisions and throw money out at charitable causes without any forethought is ripe for disaster as far as we're concerned. My third myth is that some donors, or some people have concerns that donors have too much control over their donor-advised fund. In fact, the fact is that donor-advised funds provide greater oversight and compliance and are less susceptible to abuse. Because the only influence a donor has with a donor-advised fund is to recommend grants and recommend investments. And it's our job as the sponsoring charity to ensure that every grant that goes out is to a legitimate charity for a legitimate charitable purpose. And in the 2006 Pension Protection Act, they actually added additional measures to protect that legitimacy of those transactions by ensuring that if an improper grant is made to a charity, not only are we at fault, could be held liable, so could the donor, and so could the charity, up to 125% of the transaction costs. So the overlay of compliance, we have found of all the grants that we work with, when we decline a grant, more often than not, it's because the donor is making a grant to an organization that is not a legitimate charity, that is actually engaging in charitable fraud. And we're protecting the donors against that fraudulent activity because it'll have a wonderful sounding name attached to it. It sounds like it's something that's making a difference, when in fact, through our investigative work, we realize it is not the case at all. The last point I would just make is that one of the things, and I'm happy to answer any questions, and again, thank you for this opportunity, is that, again, one of the things that I think is probably the most interesting factors of what we've seen in our organization over the last several years is, one, that donors are using and diversifying their philanthropy in a way, the same way as what they're doing with their personal assets. Because you don't just use a checkbook to invest in the stock market. You'll have a retirement savings account, use your 401k or a 403b plan. You'll use savings accounts for other things. You'll use investment accounts to invest your money. And donors are doing exactly that with their philanthropy. They have donor-advised funds. They're utilizing private or family foundations. They maybe even have a charitable remainder trust or gift annuity. And so this diversification of philanthropy just expresses the best way in which for us to pursue our philanthropic interests, however they best meet our particular tax and other investment and personal needs as individuals. And the other trend I mentioned at the outset, and it really bears a point, both of which has been echoed by my colleagues here, this notion that organizations and foundations and individuals are working collaboratively and co-venturing together to make transformative grants is a huge change in this industry. No longer are the silos up and down and that people are not talking with one another. Everybody is out there trying to make a difference in the best possible way that they can. And we can't just rely on foundations or individuals to make those changes in this world. It takes the collective impact of philanthropy, of government, and other institutions to really make a difference in this world. And we're just one part of that, and it's our privilege to be a part of that in the way that we work every day. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm sure many of you have questions now, so let me take whoever wants to go first. Who has a question? And if you could identify yourself, please.
I'm visiting with my grandson. Andrew, is there a minimum amount of money that a donor has to have in order to go into a DAF?
Donor-advised funds, each donor-advised fund has its own policies and how they set their minimums. So there's some donor-advised funds that allow you to establish them with as little as $5,000. NPT's minimum is $25,000, just for instance. Some people have said that donor-advised funds have essentially democratized philanthropy because prior to, It used to be that if you wanted to be a philanthropist, you had to establish a foundation. Similar back in 1913, if you wanted to trade stocks, you had to buy a seat on the New York Stock Exchange. Now, to have essentially the same capacity as Bill and Melinda Gates, you can do that with a very modest amount of money with a donor-advised fund. And I think, again, the key would be, which I think is also important, a lot of sponsors of donor-advised funds, it's beyond just money. It's also helping donors really become better philanthropists, providing them resources, expertise. I think Stacy mentioned, if we don't have the answer, you're hopefully one phone call away from it or from an institution that can help you do that. Pursue whatever interest that you have. One of the things, for instance, we've done is we have a network of 15 philanthropic consultants around the country that we work with to help donors set up mission statements, strategic grant-making activities, and the like. So there's a lot of institutions out there, and I think the key is once you're a part of this community, Regional Association of Grantmakers, Exponent, and others. I mean, there are great institutions, I think, that a generation ago didn't exist for a philanthropist to become more impactful in their giving, which is great. Yep.
Who's next?
I'll ask a question. Patty Giglio, I'm a member of the Press Club. Emily, can you tell us a little bit about how you're leveraging this collective impact, how you're creating partnerships to create change at the local level? Can you give me a little bit of a picture of how that's happening?
Absolutely. So I mentioned that we're working in the field of juvenile justice reform. I say that now. Originally, we were just trying to help kids who had gotten in trouble with the law, and then we found ourselves working on system reform. And we realized that has to be done in a collective way. And so over the years in Connecticut, which is where we're based, we started to build relationships with people, all different types of folks who had something to do with the justice system. And that was state level people that who were running the detention centers and the jails and prisons, advocates who were fighting against some of those jails and prisons, community organizations who had concern about their own neighbors and their local populations, and our funding partners like our local community foundation and other foundations. And we decided to come together to start to really look at some of the really challenging policies in our state. And we formed a group called the Connecticut Juvenile Justice Alliance that brings together leaders from all around, stakeholders that are, and some of those leaders are advocates for children and families who are parent representatives, and some of them are police chiefs in our largest cities. And we sort of check all our agendas at the door and come in to talk about juvenile justice and our little piece of the pie and how we can make a difference in influencing policy. And over a period of about 15 years of investments in this area, both for the foundation sort of contributing to the participating organizations and also acting as a facilitator or funding a neutral facilitator to come in and bring these groups together and air all the dirty laundry and hear everyone's concerns and come to consensus around a vision for changing the system. We saw incredible change in our state's legislation, where suddenly laws were passed where where young people were not going to detention for non-criminal activity for the first time. Our age of juvenile jurisdiction, criminal responsibility, was raised from 16 to 18. We had policies passed to now outlaw schools from suspending and expelling kids out of school for school policy violations, like things that are really of no public safety risk or even risk to themselves, but are just annoying the adults that are administrators in the school. So these were, those three examples of policy changes have helped tens of thousands of young people each year in the state of Connecticut to avoid being pushed out of school, and going into detention and high levels of incarceration in our juvenile justice and adult criminal justice system. So now we're working in New York State to replicate that kind of change, because we have sort of 15 years of legislative change, policy change, and also data to show that these policies are really working, that the state is saving money, that taxpayers are saving money, that people are safer in their communities, and young people are being more successful. So now we have a collective group working in New York State also around juvenile justice reform that includes everything from deputy secretaries from the Andrew Cuomo's administration down to folks who are running community groups and advocates, and we're working together on a regular basis, meeting and grappling with the most serious challenges in our state to make our system better.
Other question?
Kind of a follow-up question for Emily. I'm Andy Carroll with Exponent Philanthropy. What would you say, Emily, makes private foundation particularly effective at being a catalyst and doing the listening and convening that you've been able to do around this issue?
Well, one of the things that is amazing about working in the field of philanthropy is that people generally return your phone calls. If you decide to invite people to lunch or to a meeting, they generally come. And so we have this incredible, unique power to gather people. We don't have a particular opinion about how things should go. We're not trying to impose our views. We really try to be that neutral convener. And it is something that I didn't really understand was a tool in my toolbox until we started to do it for the first time. And so, when our board said, "Are we, what are we going to invest in?" and we started to look very broadly at disadvantaged youth and families, and said, "Well, we need to ask questions. What part of this enormous sea of problems can we possibly focus in on and really affect change in?" We invited people to come into our boardroom to discuss, where they saw the opportunities and challenges and what was keeping them up at night and what was exciting them and what they were worried about. And, so judges said yes, and governor's officials said yes, and families said yes, and we were able to bring people together in that way. And so it just, the light bulb went off, and I said, well, this was just our research and development phase of what we're going to do, but now we have relationships with all these people, and we started to build a trusting relationship, and we really heard what they had to say, and we were there for them in a way that I think, we didn't have a personal vested interest coming in, and we didn't ask them, what can you do this for us? We said, what can we do for you? So it opened up a door, I think, that, unfortunately, philanthropy has this image of being, these grand oak doors that nobody has the keys to, and there's decisions being made behind them, and huge amounts of money. And the fact is, we're out in the community talking to people. We're visiting constantly with the constituencies that we really care about. And so there's a face on it. There's a trusting relationship. But it does take time. And like I said, we had to say, what can we do for you? And the payoff has been tremendous. It really has. And now we have these incredible partners in Connecticut who are helping us in the New York work, because they have experienced the leverage opportunity of working with private philanthropy and how it enabled them to make, some of them are very reform-minded and really wanted to make these changes. So now, just a week from today, I have the top-level people in Connecticut who really made the change happen at the state level coming to New York and meeting with their peers in New York to talk about the data, the nuances of what they did and how it worked, and they're offering themselves as resources for their colleagues in other states.
Hi.
I have another question. Can can and should foundations and other philanthropic organizations model the kinds of public policy change that have been so successful with the Tao Foundation at the federal level? Is there a role for this community in creating public policy change at the federal level?
Who wants to take that one?
Sure. Let me take a shot at it. I think the way to answer that is to actually think about what Emily said as a poster child for how they worked at a local level and affected change and made things happen. And if you think about, perhaps the federal level being that local level on steroids, it's much bigger, it's much broader, it's much more complicated, but I'd suggest that all of the techniques and the ways that she made things happen locally and now going cross-state, crossing one border, it's 8 more to go, but it can happen. And so, yes, I think there is a role for and you had said in your question foundations. I would argue it's philanthropists, because that really goes to what we're talking about here, that it's not just foundations. And while I have the mic, I'm just going to make an observation. Listening to my two colleagues, I started jotting down words that I was hearing. And I sort of came up with a little glossary, I think, that really does describe this face of philanthropy the way we're talking about it. So in no particular order, the words that kept coming up were relationships, leveraging, partners, collaboration, leaders, impact, democratization, change, and trust. And I think that's really the key to making this all work, regardless of what that giving vehicle is. So, but in answer to your question, absolutely. And I think it can happen.
I would just, I would add a few things. Historically, Head Start, polio vaccine. You know why you have the side strips on the highway for protecting cars so they don't go off roads? Every single one of those initiatives and countless others were started by foundations in this country, were funded by foundations in this country, all federal policies and initiatives. I think philanthropy has a critical role to play at the federal level. To Emily's point, there's not an agenda except an agenda to make a difference in this world. They bring parties together, cross the aisle. If there's one thing Washington needs right now, it's a lot more collaboration, discussion, and common interest working together. So I think the fear for a lot of philanthropies and a lot of charities is to engage in it right now. There's a concern about, quote, lobbying and advocacy work. But if every charitable organization in their mission statement, practically every one of them has the word education, advance, some of the word, things that Henry's mentioning. If you're not advocating for your cause at the federal, state, and local level, you're not fulfilling your mission as an organization.
I'm going to pick up on that. Certainly one of the hot buttons in this world right now of philanthropy is the whole concept of impact investing. And I will use foundations for a moment here, where, as many of you may know, they're required to pay out 5% of their assets. The question is, what do you do with the other 95%? And do you put them to work in ways that are consistent with your mission? And I think what Andrew was just saying is there's also, I would maybe even say a moral imperative that as part of your mission, you're trying to advance your cause. So it's not good enough to just say we're going to put money into cancer research. It's what can you do to help affect change, to be an advocate for that, so that NIH gets funded, or research dollars go where they're happening, or when there's a government shutdown, research doesn't come to a halt. Because that's just not part of what you are. So as I said in my remarks, there's a lot of other currencies beyond just dollars. And as philanthropic leaders, we have the opportunity and the obligation to leverage those, whether it's convening and bringing people together, whether it's educating so that certain issues are moved forward. That's really important. And the other thing about this is, I'm hard-pressed to think of another industry, if we think of philanthropy as an industry, where everybody who's a philanthropist, there's no competition. If I can partner with Emily and we can get something done, because we both share that passion, there's no patent that I'm worried she's going to steal. There's no she's going to get to market first with it and I'm going to be in second place. We're in fact going to help save some kids or give them a better life in a juvenile justice system. So that one of the tricks, one of the really things we really have to do is to collaborate together and work together to move things, both in terms of local programming, local initiatives, but also in terms of getting society as a whole to change.
Since we're talking about advocacy and change, and we're here in DC, why not just do this through political giving as the limits are going away? Why are people still doing philanthropy? Who wants to answer that question?
So, sure, why are people still doing philanthropy? Well, you know, I think I'd much rather trust the person at the soup kitchen who's helping people, or the cancer doctor doing research, or whatever, than a politician to take that money and put it to good use. And, you know, with all due respect to everybody on Capitol Hill, I think you only have to look over the last several years to really wonder, are they capable of doing anything that's really going to move some of these major issues without political overtones? As a philanthropist, you have the opportunity to direct those funds where you want them to go. You can invest in a politician and hope that maybe they remember what you're interested in, and you hope that they're able to break through the clutter and make something happen. As a philanthropist, Emily, for instance, could use her power to convene, to bring people together, to use some of their funds to actually create change. So for me, it's a no-brainer as to philanthropy over politics.
So I think we're not working directly in politics, but we are working directly with people who are in politics in a way that's supportive and educational. So I think we're doing both. And you know, we have a state senator in Connecticut, Chris Murphy, who's very interested in justice reform issues, and he's been a proponent on federal policy around juvenile justice. And we see him as a very, very important partner in our work. And when he's in Connecticut, we meet with him. We go to facilities, prisons together, and we share the information and data that we know, but we're not investing in his political campaign. But we see him as an important partner. Because of the work that the Tao Foundation has done in juvenile justice reform, when New York when our governor came out in January this year in his State of the State address and said we're going to raise the age of criminal responsibility in New York because New York is one of only 2 states left in the country that has 16 as the age of criminal responsibility. So all young people 16 and older go directly into the adult system. I had the honor of being named to the governor's commission to really study this issue and make a proposal to the governor's office on how to raise the age and do it in a very smart and intentional way. And so I think that we are interacting with politicians and policymakers in a way that is very appropriate for foundations to do, and that we don't necessarily have to get involved in the politics of what's going on in the rest of their careers, but we can be tremendously influential, I think, in the political arena, well within the limits of the law and appropriately, and that I would love to see more of my colleagues working in that way. I think it's a trend, and I'm glad to say that we have a lot of partners in that, but there are many who still aren't.
Other questions?
You spoke in your introductory, I'm sorry, I'm Ken Gill, I'm also a member of the Press Club. You spoke in your introductory comments about some of the great stories that are going on in philanthropy, and wondering maybe, Henry, in your position, if you have any examples of some of the great stories of how you've helped people sort of realize their dreams of helping out, you know, following their passion, you know, donating their money in the areas that they want. You know, are there any of those great stories that you can share with us, or how your organization goes about getting people to that, to follow their passions?
Well, I think that, you know, the key word you used in that is following, or phrase is following your passions. Yeah, as an organization, we really pride ourselves on meeting people where they are and not telling them, for instance, that the juvenile justice system is more important than the symphony or feeding the homeless or finding a cure for cancer. That I really believe is an individual's passion. And we, you know, we guide them, we connect them with opportunities, we talk about them so that we can raise their profile and help them really be a champion for them and help them become better leaders because of that. I think about some of the stories. I mean, one of my favorite stories, for instance, is a woman in Wisconsin who, one of our members who was inspired coming to a program and meeting other people, talking to them, and had this vision of bringing dental care to rural Wisconsin, and went back and said, well, I don't have the money myself, but put together a coalition of people to put, you know, a mobile van out on the roads and the back roads of Wisconsin. So now there's lots of kids smiling. And I think that's the power of being able to leverage your resources and you work with your colleagues, a lot of what we've been talking about, in order to follow your passion. Off the top of my head, I think I'm lost for another story, but that's, you know, typical of the kind of thing that would go on.
I just have a couple examples, and just one other thing, point on Stacy's question of why philanthropy. Philanthropy is a cultural touchstone of this country. It predates our founding as a nation. First fundraising campaign was done by Harvard in the 1600s. At the time, they called it begging. First gift of real estate was made by a woman to Harvard University to help them expand their campus. Ben Franklin, all the, you know, many of the founding fathers created the first hospitals in this country. There was nothing on the tax code that encouraged them to do this. It's part of the human condition. We as humans, when asked to give, our default is to say yes. It's part of our DNA in this country, and it's transcended us for 400 plus years. To give you an example of this in action, we had a donor. His name is he gave a lot of money to this university in New Jersey that they changed the name of the university after him, Henry Rowan. And he came to us with his home, which was built in the 1800s. And this was, in fact, it was appraised at about $6 million. He sold it for $4.5 million. He said, I don't need the $6 million deduction. I just want to sell the home. And we sold it to the county, who preserved it for open space and land. He added $500,000 in cash, and his objective was to support a school in Pennsylvania that provides free education to provide a trade to students. These are kids that aren't going to community college or Harvard or Penn State or any major university. These are kids that they train them, they give them a free education, they become landscapers, laborers, auto mechanics, etc. But he had a challenge. He said to the school, listen, I want to give you $5 million towards your endowment, but you have to raise $5 million from new donors to do that. Now, this is not a Harvard where they have, you know, they can pick up the phone and call somebody and get $5 million at the drop of the hat, because they had to also be new donors. So we set this whole structure up for him. We accounted and did the administration, making sure that all the dollars that were coming in were from new donors. Well, they were struggling to do this. And lo and behold, the Wall Street Journal had come to us and said, listen, we'd like to profile one of your donors who made $1 million gift and done something interesting. And it so happened that the local press had covered it, and so Mr. Rowan said, well, you can tell them, yeah, fine, have them talk to me about it. So it's great. So they profile his $1 million gift, which was actually $4.5 million real estate. But then they heard about the grant. I mean, this is where you want it to go. It's like, okay, we had the transaction, but then they learned about the school and the grant. They said, this is wonderful. So they did a story in the Wall Street Journal. Lo and behold, who reads it? A local donor in Pennsylvania who was one of these major foundations. In fact, I think he runs one of the largest foundations in Philadelphia. And he calls up Henry. He says, Henry, how you doing on that campaign? Well, we're a little short. We're still trying to raise money. He goes, Henry, you've got the money. You've got the match. That's what makes these moments, and about the life-changing ability of philanthropy, and encapsulates it in one way. But what we need to do in this country is to continue to foster and encourage it in any way we can. But again, it's not the only thing that's going to set this country on its course on the right path and to be able to solve all the problems. But it sure can make a huge difference and a huge impact in many, many ways with people's lives directly. And I mean, the stories that you've heard today, I wish they could be just carried over and over. At least we're put on film for it, so we'll put it on the web. But that's just one example.
Thank you. I think we're pretty close to time, but did anybody have one more question before we close up? If not, I want to thank you all. That was a lovely note to end on the power of philanthropy and why we all devote so much attention to it. I'm sure that our speakers will be happy to stay and answer any direct questions you have, but also please just pick up the phone anytime you need anything in the world of philanthropy. Any of us are happy to help you out and figure out just even where the story is. So thank you very much for your time, and we appreciate it. Thank you. Thank you to our speakers.